Hi, and welcome back to Crochet Every Day with Judy. Today we're reading from Heidi, starting with Chapter 13, A Summer Evening on the Mountain. Mr. Sesamon, a good deal annoyed and excited, went quickly upstairs and knocked on Miss Rottenmeier's door. "Please make haste and come down to me in the dining room," he called. "We must make ready for a journey at once." Miss Rottenmeier looked at her clock. It was just 4:30. She had never risen so early before in her life. What could have happened? She was so filled with curiosity and excitement that she took hold of everything the wrong way. In her haste, she kept on searching everywhere for garments which she had already put on. Meanwhile, Mr. Sesamon had rung the bells in turn, which communicated with the several servants' rooms, causing frightened figures to leap out of bed, convinced that the ghost had attacked the master and that he was calling for help. One by one, they made their appearance in the dining room, each with a more terrified face than the last, and were astonished to see their master walking up and down, looking perfectly well, and with no appearance of having had an encounter with a ghost. John was sent off without delay to get the horses and carriage ready. Tinette was ordered to wake Heidi and get her dressed for a journey. Sebastian was hurried off to the house where Detta was in service to bring her around. Miss Rottenmeier was directed to pack a trunk at once for Heidi. She was disappointed, for she had hoped to have the mystery explained. But Mr. Sesamon had no thought or time for explanations, and left her standing there while he went to speak to Clara. He sat down beside his little daughter and told her everything that had occurred during the past night. He repeated the doctor's verdict and told Clara that he had decided to send Heidi home at once. Clara was very much distressed and at first made all kinds of suggestions for keeping Heidi with her. Her father was firm, however, and promised her, if she would be reasonable and make no further fuss, that he would take her to Switzerland next summer. So Clara made no further objection. She insisted that Heidi's trunk be brought into her room to be packed so that she might add whatever she liked, and her father was only too pleased to let her provide a good outfit for the child. Meanwhile, Detta had arrived. When Mr. Sesamon asked her to take Heidi home, she at once began to make excuses. She was afraid to go, for she well remembered Uncle's angry words. Mr. Sesamon dismissed her and sent for Sebastian. He told the butler he was to travel with the child as far as Basel that day, and the next day take her home. He would give him a letter to carry to the grandfather, which would explain everything. "But there is one thing in particular which I wish you to look after," said Mr. Sesamon in conclusion, "and be sure you listen well to what I say. I know the people of the hotel in Basel where I want you to go. When you get there, go at once into the child's room and see that the windows are all firmly fastened so that they cannot be easily opened. After she is in bed, lock the door of her room on the outside, for she walks in her sleep and might run into danger in a strange house if she went wandering downstairs and tried to open the front door. Do you understand?" "Oh, then that was it?" exclaimed Sebastian, for now a light was thrown on the ghostly visitations. "Yes, that was it. You are a coward, and you may tell John he is the same in the whole household, a pack of idiots." And with this, Mr. Sesamon went off to his study to write a letter to Uncle. When the letter was finished, Mr. Sesamon went into the dining room. Breakfast was now ready, and he asked, "Where is the child?" Heidi was brought in, and as she walked up to him to say good morning, he looked inquiringly into her face and said, "Well, what do you say to this little one?" Heidi looked at him in perplexity. "Why, you don't know anything about it, I see," laughed Mr. Sesamon. "You are going home today, going at once." "Home?" murmured Heidi in a low voice, turning pale. She was so overcome that for a moment or two she could hardly breathe. "Excuse me." I apologize. "Don't you want to hear more about it?" "Oh, yes, yes," exclaimed Heidi, her face now rosy with delight. "All right, then," said Mr. Sesamon as he sat down and motioned her to take her place. "Eat a good breakfast, and then off you go in the carriage." But Heidi could not swallow a morsel, though she tried to. She was in such a state of excitement that she hardly knew whether she was awake or dreaming. "Run up to Clara and stay with her till the carriage comes around," Mr. Sesamon said kindly. Heidi had been longing for this and ran quickly upstairs. An immense trunk was standing open in the middle of the room. "Come along, Heidi," cried Clara as she entered. "See all the things I have had put in for you. Aren't you pleased?" And she ran over a list of things, dresses and aprons and handkerchiefs and all kinds of working materials. "And look here," she added, as she triumphantly held up a basket. Heidi peeped in and jumped for joy, for inside it were 12 beautiful, round white rolls, all for grandmother. In their delight, the children forgot that the time had come for them to separate, and when someone called out, "The carriage is here," there was no time for grieving. Heidi ran to her room to get her darling book. This was put in the basket with the rolls. Then she opened her wardrobe to look for another treasure which no one would have thought of packing, the old red scarf. Heidi wrapped it around something else which she laid on top of the basket so that the red package was quite conspicuous. Then she put on her pretty hat and left the room. The children could not spend much time over their farewells, for Mr. Sesamon was waiting to put Heidi in the carriage. Miss Rottenmeier stood at the top of the stairs to say goodbye to her. When she caught sight of the strange little red bundle, she took it out of the basket and threw it on the ground. "No, no, Adelaide," she exclaimed. "You cannot leave the house with that thing. What can you possibly want with it?" And then she said goodbye to the child. Heidi did not dare take up her little bundle, but she gave the master of the house an imploring look, as if her greatest treasure had been taken away from her. "No, no," said Mr. Sesamon in a very decided voice. "The child shall take home with her whatever she likes, kittens and tortoises, if it pleases her. We need not put ourselves out about that, Miss Rottenmeier." Heidi quickly picked up her bundle with a look of joy and gratitude. As she stood by the carriage door, Mr. Sesamon gave her his hand and said he hoped she would remember him and Clara. He wished her a happy journey, and Heidi thanked him for all his kindness and added, "And please say goodbye to the doctor for me and give him many, many thanks." She had not forgotten that he had said to her the night before, "It will be all right tomorrow," and she rightly guessed that he had helped to make it so for her. Heidi was now lifted into the carriage, and then the basket and the provisions were put in, and finally Sebastian took his place. Then Mr. Sesamon called out once more, "A pleasant journey to you," and the carriage rolled away. Heidi was soon sitting in the railway carriage holding her basket carefully on her lap. She would not let it out of her hands for a moment, for it contained the delicious rolls for grandmother. For many hours she sat as still as a mouse. She was just beginning to realize that she was going home to the grandfather, the mountain, the grandmother, and Peter. Pictures of all she was going to see again rose one by one before her eyes. Her only fear was that the grandmother was dead. After a while, Heidi fell asleep, and after her disturbed night and early rising, she slept so soundly that she did not wake till Sebastian shook her by the arm and called to her, wake up, we shall have to get out in a minute. We are just in Basel." There was a further railway journey of many hours the next day. All of a sudden, before Heidi expected it, a voice called out, "Meienfeld!" In another minute they were standing on the platform with Heidi's trunk beside them, and the train was steaming away down the valley. Sebastian looked after it regretfully, for he preferred the easier mode of traveling to a wearisome climb on foot, especially as there was no doubt danger as well as fatigue in a country like this. Just outside the station he saw a shabby-looking little cart, which a broad-shouldered man was loading with heavy sacks. Sebastian went up to him and asked how a trunk could be taken up to Dorfli. It was finally agreed that the man should take both the child and the trunk to Dorfli, and there find someone who could be sent on with Heidi up the mountain. "I can go by myself. I know the way well from Dorfli," put in Heidi, who had been listening attentively to the conversation. Sebastian was greatly relieved at not having to do any mountain climbing. He drew Heidi aside and gave her a thick package and a letter for her grandfather. The package, he told her, contained money for her from Mr. Sesamon, and she must put it at the bottom of her basket under the rolls and be very careful not to lose it. Heidi at once put the package and the letter at the bottom of her basket. The trunk, meanwhile, had been hoisted into the cart, and now Sebastian lifted Heidi and her basket up on the high seat and shook hands with her. The driver swung himself up beside Heidi, and the cart rolled away in the direction of the mountains, while Sebastian, glad of having no tiring and dangerous journey on foot before him, sat down in the station to await the return train. The driver of the cart was the miller at Dorfli, excuse me, and was taking home his sacks of flour. He had never seen Heidi, but like everybody in Dorfli, he knew all about her. He felt sure at once that this was the child of whom he had heard so much. He began to wonder why she had come back, and as they drove along, he entered into conversation with her. "You are the child who lived with your grandfather, Almunkel, are you not?" "Yes." "Didn't they treat you well down there that you have come back so soon?" "Yes, it was not that. Everything in Frankfurt is as nice as it could be." "Then why are you running home again?" "Only because Mr. Sesamon gave me leave, or else I should not have come." "If they were willing to let you stay, why did you not remain where you were better off than at home?" Because I would 1,000 times rather be with grandfather on the mountain than anywhere else in the world. You will think differently perhaps when you get back there, grumbled the miller, and then to himself, it's strange of her, she must know what it's like. He began whistling and said no more, and Heidi looked around her. She was beginning to tremble with excitement. She felt as if she must jump down from the cart and run with all her might till she reached the top. The clock was striking 5 as they drove into Dorfley. A crowd of women and children immediately surrounded the cart, for the arrival of the child and her trunk excited the curiosity of everybody in the neighborhood. As the miller lifted Heidi down, she said hastily, "Thank you. Grandfather will send for the trunk." Then she was going to run off when first one and then another of the bystanders caught hold of her, each one having a different question to put to her. But Heidi pushed her way through them with such an expression of distress on her face that they were forced to let her go. Heidi climbed up the steep path from Dorfley as quickly as she could. She was obliged, however, to pause now and again to take breath, for the basket she carried was rather heavy, and the way got steeper as she drew nearer the top. One thought alone filled Heidi's mind. Would she find the grandmother sitting in her usual corner by the spinning wheel? Was she still alive? At last Heidi caught sight of the grandmother's house in the hollow of the mountain, and her heart began to beat more quickly. She ran faster and faster, and her heart beat louder and louder. Then she had reached the house, but she trembled so she could hardly open the door. Then she was standing inside, unable in her breathlessness to utter a sound. "Ah, my God," cried a voice from the corner. "That was how Heidi used to run in. If only I could have her with me once again. Who is there?" "It's I, grandmother," cried Heidi as she ran and flung herself on her knees beside the old woman, and seizing her hands, clung to her, unable to speak for joy. And the grandmother herself could not say a word for some time, so unexpected was this happiness. But at last she put out her hand and stroked Heidi's curly hair and said, yes, yes, that is her hair, and her voice. Thank God he has granted my prayer." And tears of joy fell from the blind eyes upon Heidi's hand. "Is it really you, Heidi? Have you really come back to me?" "Yes, grandmother, I am really here," answered Heidi in a reassuring voice. "Do not cry, for I have really come back, and I am never going away again, and I shall come every day to see you. You won't have any more hard bread to eat for a while, for look, look." And Heidi took the rolls from the basket and piled the whole 12 up on grandmother's lap. "Ah, child, child, what a blessing you bring with you," the old woman exclaimed as she felt and seemed never to come to the end of the rolls. "But you yourself are the greatest blessing, Heidi." And again she touched the child's hair and passed her hand over her hot cheeks. "Say something, child, that I may hear your voice," she begged. While Heidi was talking, Peter's mother came in and stood for a moment overcome with astonishment. "Why, it's Heidi!" she exclaimed. "And yet can it be?" Heidi stood up, and Brigitte could not say enough in admiration of the child's dress and appearance. "You may have my hat if you like," said Heidi. "I do not want it. I have my own still." She opened her red bundle and took out her own old hat, which had become a little more battered during the journey. She had not forgotten how her grandfather had called out to Detta that he never wished to see her and her hat and feathers again. That was why she had so anxiously kept her old hat, for she had never ceased to think about going home to her grandfather. Brigitte would not take the beautiful new hat, but Heidi quietly hid it in a corner behind the grandmother's chair. Then she took off her pretty dress and put her red shawl on over her petticoat. "I must go home to grandfather," she said, "but tomorrow I shall come again. Good night, grandmother." "Yes, come again. Be sure you come again tomorrow," begged the grandmother, as she pressed Heidi's hands in hers, unwilling to let her go. "Why have you taken off that pretty dress?" asked Brigitte. "Because I would rather go home to grandfather as I am, or else perhaps he would not know me. You hardly did at first." Heidi bade Brigitte good night and continued her way up the mountain. Excuse me. All around her the steep green slopes shone bright in the evening sun, and soon the great gleaming snowfield up above came in sight. Heidi kept pausing to look around, for the higher peaks were behind her as she climbed. Suddenly a warm red glow fell on the grass at her feet. She looked back again. She had not remembered how splendid it was, nor seen anything to compare to it in her dreams. There the 2 high mountain peaks rose into the air like 2 great flames. The whole snowfield had turned crimson, and rosy-colored clouds floated in the sky above. The grass upon the mountainsides had turned to gold. The rocks were all aglow, and the whole valley was bathed in golden mist. And as Heidi stood gazing around her at all this splendor, the tears ran down her cheeks for very delight and happiness, and impulsively she put her hands together, and lifting her eyes to heaven, thanked God aloud for having brought her home, thanked him that everything was as beautiful as ever, more beautiful even than she had thought, and that it was all hers again once more. And she was so overflowing with joy and thankfulness that she could not find words to thank him enough. Not until the glory began to fade could she tear herself away. Then she ran on so quickly that in a very little while she caught sight of the tops of the fir trees above the hut roof, then the roof itself, and at last the whole hut. There was Grandfather sitting as in old days smoking his pipe, and she could see the fir trees waving in the wind. Quicker and quicker went her little feet, and before Uncle had time to see who was coming, Heidi had rushed up to him, thrown down her basket, and flung her arms around his neck, unable in the excitement of seeing him again to say more than "Grandfather, Grandfather, Grandfather," over and over again. And the old man himself said nothing. For the first time in many years his eyes were wet and he had to pass his hand across them. Then he unloosed Heidi's arms, put her on his knee, and after looking at her for a moment said, "So you have come back to me, Heidi. How is that? You don't look much of a grand lady. Did they send you away?" "Oh, no, Grandfather," said Heidi eagerly. "You must not think that. They were all so kind, Clara and Grandmamma and Mr. Sesamon. But you see, Grandfather, I did not know how to contain myself till I got home again to you. I used to think I should die, for I felt as if I could not breathe, but I never said anything because it would have been ungrateful. And then suddenly, one morning quite early, Mr. Sesamon said to me, but I think it was partly the doctor's doing, but perhaps it's all in the letter." And Heidi jumped down and brought the package and the letter and handed them both to her grandfather. That belongs to you, said the latter, laying the package down on the bench beside him. Then he opened the letter, read it through, and without a word put it in his pocket. "Do you think you can still drink milk with me, Heidi?" he asked, taking the child by the hand. "Bring your money with you. You can buy a bed and bedclothes and dresses for a couple of years with it." "I am sure I do not want it," replied Heidi. "I have got a bed already, and Clara has put such a lot of clothes in my box that I shall never want any more." "Take it and put it in the cupboard. You will want it some day, I have no doubt." Heidi took up her money and skipped happily after Grandfather into the house. She ran into all the corners, delighted to see everything again, and then went up the ladder. There she came to a pause and called down in a tone of surprise and distress, "Oh, Grandfather, my bed's gone." "We can soon make it up again," he answered her from below. "I did not know that you were coming back. Come along now and have your milk." Heidi came down, climbed on her high stool in the old place, and then taking up her bowl, drank her milk eagerly, as if she had never come across anything so delicious. As she put down her bowl, she exclaimed, "Our milk tastes better than anything else in the world, Grandfather." A shrill whistle was heard outside. Heidi darted out like a flash of lightning. There were the goats leaping and springing down the rocks with Peter in their midst. When he caught sight of Heidi, he stood still with astonishment and gazed speechlessly at her. Heidi called out, "Good evening, Peter," and then ran in among the goats. "Little Swan, little Bear, do you know me again?" The animals evidently recognized her voice at once, for they began rubbing their heads against her and bleating loudly as if for joy, and as she called the other goats by name, one after the other, they all came scampering toward her, helter-skelter, and crowding round her. The impatient greenfinch sprang into the air and over two of her companions in order to get near, and even the shy little snowflake butted the great Turk out of her way in quite a determined manner. Heidi was almost out of her mind with delight at being among her old friends again. She flung her arms round the pretty little snowflake, stroked the mischievous greenfinch, while she herself was thrust at from all sides by the affectionate goats. So at last she came near to where Peter was still standing, not yet over his surprise. "Come down, Peter," cried Heidi, "and say good evening to me." "So you are back again?" he found words to say at last. He ran down and took Heidi's hand, which she was holding out in greeting, and immediately put the same question to her, which he had been in the habit of asking in the old days when they returned home in the evening. "Will you come out with me tomorrow?" "Not tomorrow, but the day after perhaps, for tomorrow I must go down to Grandmother." "I am glad you are back," said Peter, while his whole face beamed with pleasure. He prepared to go on with his goats, but he never had had so much trouble with them before. When at last, by coaxing and threats, he had them all together, and Heidi had gone off with an arm around each of her grandfather's two, the whole flock suddenly turned and ran after her. Heidi had to go inside the stall with her two and shut the door, or Peter would never have reached home that night. When Heidi went indoors, she found her bed already made up for her. The hay had been piled high for it and smelled delicious. The grandfather had carefully spread and tucked in the clean sheets. It was with a happy heart that Heidi lay down in it that night, and her sleep was sounder than it had been for a whole year past. The grandfather got up at least 10 times during the night and mounted the ladder to see if Heidi was all right and showing no signs of restlessness. But Heidi did not stir. She had no need now to wander about, for the great burning longing of her heart was satisfied. She had seen the high mountains and rocks alight in the evening glow, and she had heard the wind in the fir trees. She was at home again on the mountain. We'll stop there for today and start tomorrow with chapter 14. Thank you. Bye-bye.